if this really does get constricted, and if America is successful in manipulating the oil price, it is terribly, terribly difficult for the Russian economy.
Let's talk about that US seizure of a Russian-flagged oil tanker heading towards UK waters with Robert Fox, defence editor of the Evening Standard. Robert, good evening to you.
Good evening.
Let's just bring in Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary. She was asked about this seizure today.
This administration is going to fully enforce the sanction policy of the United States. The vessel this morning was seized in the North Atlantic pursuant to a warrant issued by a U.S. federal court after being tracked. And this was a Venezuelan shadow fleet vessel that has transported sanctioned oil. And the United States of America, under this president, is not going to tolerate that. I would also just add the vessel had a judicial seizure order and the crew. So that means the crew is now subject to prosecution for any applicable violation of federal law. And they will be brought to the United States for such prosecution if necessary.
Yeah, she was being asked about Russia there. We'll return to that. I do wonder whether, while we wait for John Healey, you could describe exactly what took place this afternoon.
Me?
Yes, yeah. Please, Robert.
Yeah, well, this had been planned for some time because they've been after these ships that they regard as part of the shadow fleet. She was number 3. I'm not quite sure what to call the oil tanker, because as the Americans say, with some justification, she should still be referred to as the Bella One, registered under a Guyana flag. Was one of the crazy things that happened. By the way, the Americans suspected it was being used to get sanctioned oil out of Venezuela, destined for China, which is where this ship had mostly offloaded. 3 out of 4 of its last destinations for offloading are registered as being in China. The ship flees the American Coast Guard as the operation to remove Maduro takes place, and as Trump really puts it there, that America was attempting to take over the management of Venezuela. It heads out into the North Atlantic, moves around in a far from straightforward course, and then changes its flag and changes its name in mid-ocean. So now we come to the position of, can you do that? And there is much debate about it, and legally, I believe you can't, because if you re-register, you have to submit to inspection, and it has to be cleared that it can be done. If you declare yourself unilaterally that you're changing the registration, you become stateless, and that makes the situation for the apprehension by the Americans, and they say they were doing it under American law and under American sanctions, much clearer. What is absolutely fascinating, there are 2 things that are fascinating about this. They did another one. At the same time as they were completing the boarding, they used Coast Guard-enabled agents. I think they'd been shipped through Britain and the main bases in England of the US Air Force, and had gone out and had been dropped over by helicopter and supported. It was at quite a distance. And this is where I think British shipping becomes involved. An RFA tanker, that's Royal Fleet Auxiliary, a Poseidon 8 surveillance plane for the RAF. There was even, I think, at times in the area, combat air patrol by Typhoon. And then the mysterious thing is an Atlas transporter. Atlas transporters, which is an Airbus, a military plane, are used for carrying around a lot of critical kit, whether it was specialized agents like frogmen or whatever. I suspect they were dropping, with Poseidon, I think they were dropping sonars into the water to make sure that the Russians didn't have a submarine about them. But as they were doing that, much closer to Venezuela and Cuba, the American Coast Guard was apprehending yet another, a 4th tanker, the Sophia, at the same time. But the one thing that was clear, and it was clear from the Prime Minister's statement in the Commons, Britain is deeply involved in this operation. It's not a bystander.
No, absolutely. And we know that US military aircraft based at RAF bases in the UK have been deploying exercises. We know that there's involvement there. There is that is interpreted as a readying by the US to act to mobilise some of their military aircraft from UK bases if they need to. I just want to focus on Russia again here, because Russia, it's understood, had dispatched a submarine and other naval assets to the Marinera to try and protect it. There is a view here that the Kremlin was trying to fight back. And the fact that the US have taken this, as they did, by the way, in Estonia as well, when the Russian Air Force scrambled a fighter jet to prevent the Estonian Navy from boarding the Jaguar, another Shadow Fleet tanker, back in May last year. So they were doing that again to try and ward off the United States. That is what I understand. But the United States went ahead anyway. And so, you know, although the United States thinks it's a stateless vessel, Russia considers it, and it's what Russia's optics are. Russia considers the Marinera as their own, as one of their own, a Russian-flagged vessel. It's on their books. And so, therefore, the question here is, will Russia respond? How will Russia interpret this offensive action by the United States?
Well, I think that they're thinking very deeply, because they haven't sort of gone off at the mouth, which they usually do in these circumstances, and you usually get the usual suspects, if you can put it like that: Lavrov, Ushakov.
All they've said is that it's a violation of international law today. That's
it.
That's come from Russia's transport ministry.
Kate, I think Russia is in a desperate situation with this, because what Russia sees with all this, with this pressure on the Shadow Fleet, is that their lifeline through the Baltic is becoming ever more constricted. There are only about 3 or 4 ports that they can really work to get their oil out now, since the Black Sea has all been but closed to them for shipping. And the main terminal used by Kazakhstan, a big energy producer, has been closed by activities of the Ukrainians. The extraordinary feature, a unique almost in history, a naval battle being prosecuted successfully by a nation, namely Ukraine, with not really a navy, which by using drones and remote things. This is absolutely vital to Russia. And it's very interesting how Kremlin advisors and former advisors to Putin have been on the airwaves today, being really quite cool about this and saying, look, the battleground, the battlescape now shifts almost from the front line in Ukraine, where things have not been going right for Russia as of the last 2 or 3 days. Several quite significant counterattacks by the Ukrainians against all the odds. But it's particularly the giant choke point that is becoming the eastern Baltic, but also the western Baltic, the narrows of the Skagerrak, where, of course, there's a lot of drone activity before Christmas. If this really does get constricted, and if America is successful in manipulating the oil price, it is terribly, terribly difficult for the Russian economy. I'm not predicting imminent collapse of the Russian economy, but it is under terminal stress, it looks like, this year.
And strategically, if the US does have some involvement in Greenland, as they are threatening to do, that is bad news again for Russia and for China.